The hallways of the school echoed with the hurried footsteps of students, the sharp buzz of fluorescent lights overhead seeming to amplify the tension in the air. Julia walked slowly, her fingers curling around the handle of her worn notebook, the weight of each step a silent reminder of the pressure she felt to maintain control in a world that often felt beyond her reach. She paused outside her classroom, her gaze lingering on the figure of Andrew, a 14-year-old boy who had somehow become invisible to most. His shoes, ragged, soles barely hanging on, spoke louder than any words could. Julia watched as he limped past a group of more privileged students, their laughter a harsh contrast to the quiet desperation in Andrew's every movement. Her heart sank. She knew what it was like to feel powerless, to carry burdens no one else saw. But this was different. It wasn't just his shoes that bothered her. It was what they represented, an unspoken reality that she couldn't ignore any longer. Julia had always prided herself on being the kind of teacher who noticed the little things, those small moments where a student's true self slipped through the cracks of the classroom walls. But today, as the bell rang and her students filed in, she couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of the world was pressing down on her more than usual. The school, with its rows of aging lockers and worn tiles, had always felt like a place of sanctuary for Julia. She had been here for nearly a decade, her passion for teaching not yet dulled by the long hours, the broken system, or the steady encroachment of bureaucracy. The school was in a working-class neighborhood, one where the children were a reflection of the lives they led outside these walls, struggling, often overlooked, and always fighting for something better. Julia understood their pain. She had grown up not far from here, in a small apartment, with parents who worked two jobs just to keep the lights on. She knew what it felt like to have your dreams stifled by the weight of financial burdens, to watch as others passed you by, not out of malice, but because they didn't even see you in the first place. But in the classroom, Julia felt she could make a difference. She taught history, her lessons filled with passion for the past and an unyielding belief in the possibility of change. Yet lately, she had begun to question that belief. The school felt different these days. The halls, once filled with the sounds of laughter and spirited conversation, now seemed quieter, a little colder. The students who passed through them walked with their heads down, their eyes avoiding the gaze of others. There was a subtle shift in the air, an undercurrent of tension that Julia couldn't quite place. The pressure had been mounting from all sides. Budget cuts had gutted the school's resources, leaving her with a classroom full of students who, despite their potential, lacked the materials to succeed. Teachers were leaving one by one, their frustrations mounting as they were asked to do more with less. Julia, though tired, had always kept going. Until recently, she couldn't shake the sense that things were slipping out of her control. And today, looking at Andrew's worn shoes, she felt a sharp jolt of recognition. It wasn't just the shoes. It was the small, invisible ways in which society had failed him, and so many others like him. Andrew wasn't the first student to show up with a broken backpack or shoes held together by duct tape. He wasn't the first to arrive with a silent, desperate hope that someone, anyone, would see them for what they truly were. Not just another poor kid with a problem, but a human being with a future. Julia had always tried to be that someone, but with every student she helped, with every small act of kindness she offered, she began to feel the crushing weight of a system designed to keep them down. There was only so much one teacher could do after all, and she had begun to wonder if her efforts were enough. Would it ever be enough? The morning passed in a blur of lessons, but Julia's mind kept drifting back to Andrew. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at the new shoes she'd bought for him. His expression a mix of surprise and confusion, like he couldn't quite understand why someone would care enough to offer help. It weighed on her as she sat at her desk during lunch, scanning through a stack of papers. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. A text from her colleague, Sarah. "Hey, Julia, we need to talk. Principal Morris is looking for you." Julia's fingers hovered over the screen. She didn't like the sound of that. Morris was an old-school administrator, a man whose philosophy was rooted in discipline and efficiency, not compassion. He had always seemed indifferent to the struggles of his students, focusing instead on test scores and keeping things running smoothly. She had never been in his crosshairs before, but she knew enough to know when things were about to get bad. Setting the phone down, Julia grabbed her bag and made her way to the principal's office. The hallway seemed longer today, as though the walls were closing in with every step. She tried to push down the unease creeping into her chest, but it only grew with each footfall. When she reached the office, she found Principal Morris sitting behind his desk, his back straight, his fingers steepled in front of him. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood Jessica, the school's head of administration, a woman known for her strict adherence to protocol and her no-nonsense approach to discipline. The sight of them together made Julia's stomach drop. This was no casual conversation. "Julia, please, take a seat." Julia did as instructed, the weight of their gaze making her feel small, like a student in trouble instead of the teacher she had been for years. "We've been receiving complaints from some parents about your extracurricular involvement with students, specifically regarding Andrew Thomas." Julia's heart skipped. She didn't need to ask. She knew exactly where this was headed. Andrew's shoes. She hadn't even had the chance to tell him, but the whispers had already started. "I understand you bought Andrew a new pair of shoes. I'm sure your intentions were noble, but this is not appropriate behavior. We cannot have teachers stepping outside the boundaries of their role. You've overstepped it, Julia, and this is not the first time. Your help has caused nothing but disruption. You're creating a situation where students expect preferential treatment, where they feel entitled to things beyond what's appropriate for their circumstances." Julia's hands clenched in her lap, her pulse quickening. This wasn't about the shoes. This was about the systemic inequities they were all too familiar with. The way the school treated the students from lower-income families like they were invisible, like they didn't matter. Andrew didn't ask for the shoes, and he didn't ask for any of this. He's just a kid trying to survive. I'm trying to help him. You are a teacher, Julia. Your job is to teach, not to become personally involved in their problems. You've disrupted the environment here. There are rules, boundaries. Julia's mouth went dry. She knew what was coming next. She'd seen it before. How the system punished those who tried to push against it. They were afraid of change, afraid of anyone questioning the way things were. "We've already spoken to Andrew's mother. She understands that there are limits to what can be done. We've advised her to seek outside help. Your actions, Julia, are making this worse." Her words hit like a slap. Julia fought to keep her voice steady, but the frustration rose in her chest, hot and sharp. Making it worse? How is offering a child a pair of shoes making it worse? How is showing him that he matters making it worse? For a moment, there was silence. Principal Morris and Jessica exchanged a look, as if deciding whether or not to push further. "It's making us look bad, Julia. We can't have teachers overstepping their roles. You're dismissed, effective immediately. Consider this your termination." The words landed with a weight so heavy, Julia felt the floor beneath her buckle. She stared at Morris, disbelief freezing her. Terminated, just like that, for trying to help a student. "Julia, you're firing me because I bought a kid's shoes? I'm firing you because you've created chaos in my school. We do things by the book here. I can't have teachers acting as if they're running a charity." Julia's heart beat wildly, the world around her spinning. It didn't matter how much good she'd done. It didn't matter how many kids she'd helped, how many lives she'd touched. In the end, it was about keeping things neat, keeping things controlled. And anyone who dared to challenge that was expendable. Without another word, Julia stood up and left the office, the door clicking shut behind her like a final sentence. That night, Julia sat in the silence of her apartment, the stillness amplifying the shock that had yet to settle. Her phone sat on the coffee table, untouched. The weight of her actions was sinking in, but it was the weight of the consequences that was hardest to bear. She had tried to make a difference, to take a stand for what was right, and now she was unemployed. The phone rang. She stared at the screen. Unknown number. She picked it up with trembling hands, unsure of what to expect. "Miss Julia Turner?" Julia swallowed hard. "Yes. I'm Richard Marlowe. I've heard about what happened today. I'm very interested in your story." Julia's brow furrowed. She didn't recognize the name. "I think we need to talk." The moment hung in the air like a question mark, and Julia, unsure of what was happening or where it would lead, felt a flicker of hope ignite deep inside her. A hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something that could change everything. Julia's hand shook slightly as she held the phone to her ear, unsure of what was happening or why this man, Richard Marlowe, was suddenly so interested in her situation. She tried to steady her breath, her mind still reeling from the abruptness of her termination, from the realization that her efforts to help had been twisted into something wrong. She had wanted to make a difference, to show her students that they mattered, that their struggles weren't invisible, and yet, in the end, it had been her who had been cast aside, like an inconvenience to be discarded. "I think we need to talk," Richard Marlowe's voice repeated, firm and calm. But there was something else in it, a knowing, an urgency that sent a ripple of curiosity through Julia's chest. "Who are you?" Julia asked, her voice still shaky. "How did you know about all this?" "I have my ways," Marlowe said, his tone cryptic, but not dismissive. "What happened today with Principal Morris, it didn't sit right with me. I know you're confused, upset, but I think we could work together. I think we could do something with your story." Julia sat up straighter, her pulse quickening. "You're going to help me. Why?" "Because people like you, people who are trying to make a real difference, don't get the help they need. They get trampled on. But you're different, Julia. You're exactly the kind of person who could change things if given the chance. And I want to offer you that chance." She rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of her exhaustion. Her world had been turned upside down in a matter of hours, and now this stranger was offering some kind of lifeline. But what kind of help could he offer? And why was he interested in her? She was just one teacher in a city full of them, one voice among many. What did she have that was so special? "I don't understand. How can you possibly help me?" she asked, her voice quiet now, a hint of vulnerability creeping through. "I can offer you a platform," he replied smoothly, "a chance to reach more people, to show the world what really goes on behind closed doors in places like your school. People don't know about the systemic issues, Julia. They don't see how the system is designed to keep people like Andrew and you down. But I can help you show them." Her breath caught. She felt a flicker of hope. She knew she had been fighting an uphill battle, but she hadn't realized just how deeply the system was stacked against her. How many other teachers, students, and parents were suffering under the same weight, only hidden behind a facade of rules and protocols? This wasn't just about Andrew. This was about everything. The unfairness of the system, the inequities that seemed built into every institution, the quiet oppression that people had become too numb to see, and now someone was offering to help her expose it. "I don't know if I'm the right person for that," she said slowly, feeling the gravity of the words she was about to say. "I'm just a teacher. I'm not a crusader. I don't have the resources to fight back against all of this. I'm just me." "I'm not asking you to be anyone else, Julia," Marlowe responded. "I'm asking you to be exactly who you are. You've already started. You've already made an impact. This is about amplifying that impact. What you do next, that's up to you." There was a silence on the line as Julia processed his words, as the possibilities began to swirl in her mind. She had spent her entire career quietly challenging the norms of education, trying to do the right thing, but always from the shadows. Was this the moment she could step out, stand up, and fight for what she believed in on a larger scale? Could she really make a difference? "What do you want in return?" Julia asked, cautious but curious. Marlowe paused. "I'm not asking for anything from you, Julia. I'm offering a partnership. What I want is for you to help me bring attention to these issues, to help me show people what the world of education really looks like when the walls come down." Julia felt a chill crawl down her spine. Was this really happening? Was she really considering this? She glanced over at the stack of papers on her desk, the lesson plans she had painstakingly put together, the stacks of homework yet to be graded. It all felt so distant, so insignificant now. She had spent so long trying to fit herself into a mold that she thought was just a small part of the greater system, but now she saw it for what it was, a broken system, one that seemed built to crush the spirit of anyone who tried to challenge it. I'll need time to think about it, Julia said finally, her voice steadier now. This is a huge decision. I don't know if I'm ready to make waves like that, but I'll listen. I'll hear you out. Marlowe's voice softened, his tone almost reassuring. Take all the time you need, Julia. I'll be here when you're ready. Just know, you're not alone in this anymore. As the call ended, Julia sat back in her chair, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. Her thoughts were a blur of possibilities, but the thing that struck her most was the sudden clarity she felt about what had happened at the school. Morris hadn't just fired her because of the shoes. No, this was about control, about maintaining a status quo that had been in place for decades. This was about preserving the system, keeping the inequality hidden, keeping people like Andrew from ever rising above what they had been born into. It wasn't just about one pair of shoes. It was about a system that viewed empathy as a threat. Julia had always known that teaching was more than just lesson plans and grading papers, but now, with the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders, she understood what it meant to truly fight for her students, for people who had no voice. And maybe, just maybe, this was the moment when everything would change. But even as she tried to make sense of everything, even as she tried to find her way forward, something still nagged at her, the thought of how far she was willing to go. What was she willing to sacrifice to make the change that was needed? And what if the system she was about to take on was bigger, more dangerous than she could possibly imagine? Could she really do it? Could she expose the lies and fight against the forces that had so easily tossed her aside? The questions lingered, unanswered, but there was no going back now. Julia knew that whatever path she chose, it would be one that would change everything. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of that. The days that followed were a blur of tension, uncertainty, and anticipation. Julia didn't sleep much. Every time her eyes closed, she saw Andrew's face again, his confusion, his gratitude, and the fear that he might never get a fair shot at life. She could still hear Principal Morris's voice in her head, cold and detached, the finality of his words echoing in the hollow of her apartment. She was fired. It was over. And yet it wasn't. She knew that now. Richard Marlowe's offer hung in the air, a tantalizing but dangerous possibility. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The power that kept her from helping Andrew, that kept students like him trapped in cycles of poverty and failure, was deeply embedded in the system. And if she was going to make a difference, she would need to take a stand against that system. But standing up meant facing consequences. Consequences she wasn't sure she was ready for. On the third day after her termination, Julia found herself back at the school, standing at the gates, unsure of what to do next. She hadn't spoken to anyone from her old life yet. No other teachers, no students. It felt like the walls of the school had closed in on her, making her feel like an outsider. The hum of the school building seemed to mock her from the outside, like a place that no longer belonged to her. Then her phone buzzed, a text from Richard. Richard Marlowe. We need to move quickly. There's a press conference tomorrow. I want you to be there. Julia's heart stuttered in her chest. A press conference. Was she ready for this? Could she really go public with everything? The thought of standing in front of cameras, of having her story told to the world, terrified her. But it also ignited something fierce in her. This was her chance to bring attention to the issue, to make people see what was really happening inside those walls. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The next morning, Julia arrived at the venue, a sleek, modern building with glass walls and polished floors. Richard had arranged for her to meet him in a small private room before the press conference. When she walked in, he was sitting at a table, looking calm and collected, as though the weight of what they were about to do didn't even faze him. He gestured for her to sit, his eyes sharp but reassuring. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Julia sat down, her stomach churning. "I don't know. This is bigger than I thought. What if they attack me? What if they twist my words?" "They will try," Richard said, his tone cool. "But that's why you need to stay focused. You're here to speak the truth. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Julia swallowed hard, nodding. She could do this. She had to do this. The room was suddenly filled with the sound of people outside, journalists, reporters, camera operators, all preparing for the press conference. Julia felt her heart race in her chest, her palms slick with sweat. This wasn't just an interview. This was a battle, and she had no idea how it would play out. They walked together to the stage, and as soon as the doors opened, the room fell silent. The sharp click of camera shutters and the murmur of voices filled the air. Julia stepped up to the podium, the weight of every eye in the room turning toward her. Richard stood beside her, his presence steady, but Julia felt like she was standing alone in front of a firing squad. She looked out at the sea of faces before her, some eager, some skeptical, others just waiting for her to slip. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For a brief moment, everything went still. Then she cleared her throat and tried again. "My name is Julia Turner," she began, her voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "I've been a teacher for over 10 years, and I've spent my life trying to make a difference in the lives of my students. But recently, I was fired from my job at Thompson High School, fired for something that should never have been an issue. I was fired because I bought a pair of shoes for a student, a child who had no other option but to wear shoes that barely fit, shoes that left blisters on his feet. I did this because I saw a child in need, and I wanted to help." The room remained silent, all eyes on her. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the pressure building on her. She could almost hear Principal Morris's voice in her head again, telling her she had overstepped, that she had disrupted the system. But this was different now. She wasn't the teacher who had been silenced. She was a woman telling the world the truth. "I did what I thought was right," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But instead of being supported, I was punished. I was fired for showing empathy, for trying to make a difference, and I'm not the only one. There are students in that school, good students, who are being left behind because the system is designed to keep them there. It's not just about shoes. It's about the opportunity, or the lack of it. It's about the way we treat students who come from low-income backgrounds like they don't matter. And it's time for that to change." Her words hung in the air, the silence deafening as the journalists took it all in. Julia could see the reactions unfolding in the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads, unsure of how to respond. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the weight of what she had just unleashed. Then, someone from the back of the room stood up and shouted, "How do you justify using your position as a teacher to give charity to students? Isn't it your job to teach, not to be their personal savior?" The question hit her like a slap. It was exactly the kind of response she had feared. She could feel the heat of the gaze from the audience, waiting for her to slip. The old Julia, the one who had always been careful, who had stayed within the lines, would have faltered. But this time, something inside her had shifted. "I'm not a savior," Julia said, her voice firm and unshaken. "I'm a teacher, and if we can't take care of the basic needs of our students, if we can't give them the resources to succeed, then we're failing them. My job isn't just to teach them how to pass a test. It's to help them understand their worth, to show them that they deserve a future. And right now, that future is being stolen from them by a system that doesn't care." The room went still again, the reporters' pens pausing mid-sentence, the cameras silent. Julia could feel the weight of their stares, but this time, she didn't feel afraid. She felt alive. She had said it. The truth was out there now, hanging between them like a challenge. Then, a voice from the front of the room cut through the silence. "You're naive, Julia. You can't change the system by just giving a pair of shoes to one kid. That's not how things work." It was a voice she recognized, one of the school board members, someone who had always sided with the administration. The attack was swift and calculated. Julia's heart raced as she met his gaze, but she refused to look away. "No," she said, her voice steady. "It's not about one pair of shoes, but it's about the principle behind it. It's about the little things we do that matter. If we can't even give these kids the dignity of a pair of shoes, how are we ever going to give them the opportunity to succeed?" The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Cameras clicked rapidly, voices rose in a murmur, and Julia felt herself at the center of it all. No longer a small-time teacher, but a symbol. A lightning rod for everything that was wrong with the system. The stakes had never been higher, and for the first time, she understood the cost of standing up. She had opened Pandora's box, and now there was no turning back. The consequences were just beginning to unfold. The aftermath of Julia's words hung in the air like a charged storm, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to break. The reporters began scribbling down her responses, some with nods of approval, others with skeptical frowns. She could feel their eyes on her, some seeing her as a crusader, others as a troublemaker, DW, who dared to expose the cracks in a system that had been carefully constructed over decades. But she couldn't dwell on their reactions. She had done what she came to do, said what needed to be said, and now she felt the weight of the consequences settling in. Richard stood by her side, his posture calm but his eyes scanning the room, assessing the shifting tides. Julia's heart pounded as she realized that the battle was far from over. The room was on the verge of chaos, but it hadn't fully erupted yet. The board member's sneering comments still echoed in her ears, his dismissive attitude toward everything she had said, as if to make it clear that the fight wasn't just about shoes, but about everything she had dared to challenge. The first stirrings of the aftermath came in the form of hushed conversations, quick whispers among the journalists. Julia could see the exchange of looks, the way some of them began moving toward their phones, likely making calls to their editors, trying to figure out what angle they would take with the story. But then, as if scripted, the tension broke with the sudden appearance of two security officers at the back of the room. Julia's stomach sank. The officer's presence was enough to send a ripple through the crowd. At first, the murmurs were quiet, and Julia thought it might have been a mistake. But as the men approached the front, their eyes fixed on her with cold, businesslike precision, she knew there was no mistake. They weren't here for the press. They were here for her. "We need to speak with you, Ms. Turner," one of the officers said, his voice even, but there was an unmistakable edge of authority in his tone. His hand hovered near his belt, where his badge and gun rested. The room seemed to shrink around Julia, the cameras still flashing, the reporters now looking on with curiosity as the officers advanced toward her. Her throat tightened, but she refused to let the fear take over. She had seen this before. Teachers getting silenced by intimidation, students being dragged away for questioning. This was no different. Richard stepped forward, his face hardening. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice sharp, but there was something restrained about it, something that told Julia he had anticipated this very moment. "You're interfering with an ongoing investigation," the officer replied, his voice devoid of empathy. "We've been instructed to take Ms. Turner into custody for questioning. Please step aside, sir." Julia's heart skipped. Custody? She had only just started speaking out, only just begun to shine a light on the darkness inside the system. And already they were trying to shut her down. The weight of it crashed over her. They weren't just after her job. They wanted her silenced completely. They wanted to make an example of her. "No," Julia said firmly, her voice shaking but resolute. "I'm not going anywhere." The officer's gaze darkened, and for a moment, Julia saw the threat in his eyes like a predator calculating whether she was worth the trouble. Richard's hand subtly shifted to his phone, fingers dialing a number in an attempt to reach someone. But Julia knew there was no time to waste. The officers were here to intimidate her, but she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. One of the other officers spoke into a radio, but it was too late. The room had already begun to fracture, the chaos spreading like wildfire. Reporters shouted questions, their cameras zooming in on the officers, their voices now frantic with the realization that something major was happening. The atmosphere had shifted from tension to something darker, more volatile. Julia was no longer just a teacher on trial, she was a target. "We have to go now," one officer barked, trying to push through the crowd of onlookers. "Ms. Turner, please come with us." Richard's voice rose sharply as he addressed the officers. "You can't do this. There's no warrant. There's no reason for this arrest." But it didn't matter. The officers had already decided what to do. One of them grabbed Julia's arm, a firm grip that sent a shock through her body. She flinched, her mind scrambling for something, anything, that could stop this. But the pull of authority was too strong. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fight back, but she couldn't. "Let her go!" a voice suddenly shouted from the back of the room. Julia's eyes snapped to the source, a woman standing tall, her face fiery with anger. The woman was part of the media team, one of the reporters who had been covering the conference. More people began to join in, their voices rising, calling for Julia to be freed, questioning why she was being detained. The officer holding her arm wavered, his focus shifting as the crowd's demands grew louder. Then, like a tidal wave, backup arrived. Julia could hear the sharp screech of tires outside, the unmistakable sound of more police vehicles arriving at the scene. The doors of the room burst open, and more officers flooded into the space, their uniforms a blur of blue and black. They moved swiftly, creating a barricade between Julia and the now panicking journalists, pushing people back as the situation escalated into a full-on standoff. Richard was shouting now, trying to negotiate, trying to demand her release. But it was no use. The chaos had reached a fever pitch, with journalists clamoring for answers, their questions lost in the swell of confusion. Cameras flashed in rapid succession, capturing every movement, every moment of the escalating tension. Julia was pulled to the side by one of the officers, the grip on her arm tightening. Her heart was pounding in her ears, and she felt her breath quicken. This was it. She had exposed the corruption, had dared to challenge the powerful, and now the system was pushing back, fighting harder than she could ever have imagined. But as she was led out of the room, the cameras still snapping, the voices still shouting, Julia didn't feel defeated. She felt something else, something stronger. She felt the weight of her actions. This wasn't just a fight for Andrew anymore. This was a fight for every student who had ever been overlooked, every teacher who had ever been silenced, every voice that had been buried under the weight of a broken system. They thought they could stop her. They thought they could silence her with force and fear. But they were wrong, because no matter what happened next, Julia knew one thing. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The days following the chaotic press conference felt like a blur to Julia, each passing hour heavy with uncertainty, but also laced with an undeniable sense of purpose. The aftermath of her arrest had sparked a national conversation, but it was also a deep wound that ran through her own soul. She had been treated like a criminal for simply caring, for trying to make a difference. Yet in the midst of it all, something within her hardened. This wasn't just a fight for her job, or for Andrew, or even for the hundreds of other students whose voices had been drowned out by systemic neglect. This was a fight for justice, for the change she had always dreamed of, but never truly believed could happen. But now she saw it clearly. It was time to hold the system accountable. It was time to make the world see what they had ignored for far too long. Julia's phone rang constantly. Press requests, angry messages from old colleagues, supportive messages from strangers who had seen her interview, and others who had read the article online and felt compelled to send their own stories of injustice. She didn't have the energy to respond to all of them, but there was one message that stood out, one message that kept her up at night. It was from a former student, Marcus. She hadn't seen him in years, but his words struck her like a punch in the gut. "You showed us how to care, Miss Turner. Don't stop now." It was a simple message, but it reignited something in her. A fire that had always burned deep down, but that had grown faint over time as she navigated the murky waters of bureaucracy. She had wanted to help her students, to make them feel seen, and now it seemed it was time to turn the tables. The system that had once tried to shut her down, that had seen her compassion as a threat, was now going to feel the weight of its own actions. Julia met with Richard again, sitting in the same small office, though this time the mood was different. The chaos of the press conference had faded into a focused, determined quiet. Richard was no longer the smooth-talking businessman with an agenda. He was now a partner, someone who had been drawn into this fight as much as she had. He was taking the lead in organizing legal teams, working with journalists who were still eager to dig deeper into the corruption that ran through the school system. It wasn't just about her anymore. This was a movement, and it was growing. "We need to take action, Julia," Richard said one morning as he sat across from her, his fingers tapping against the wooden table. "This isn't just about your wrongful termination anymore. This is about exposing a broken system, one that's been exploiting kids like Andrew for years. It's time to go after the school board. It's time to take the fight to them." Julia nodded, but the weight of what they were suggesting sank in slowly. "I know," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, "but it feels impossible. We're up against so much. They'll twist everything. They'll turn this into a personal vendetta. Richard looked her in the eye, unflinching. Let them. But we have the truth on our side. And when we have the truth, the rest doesn't matter. Julia knew he was right. She had always believed in the power of education, but now she realized that education didn't just happen in classrooms. It happened in courtrooms, in the streets, in the spaces where power could be challenged. The real learning, the real change, would come from them refusing to back down. And so they began. They worked tirelessly, organizing rallies, gathering testimonials from other teachers who had faced similar repercussions for speaking out, collecting evidence of how the school system had failed its students. It was slow work, but it was necessary work. And with each step they took, Julia could feel the momentum building, like the rumblings of something far greater than just her story. Meanwhile, across town, the police officers who had arrested her were facing their own reckoning. In closed-door meetings, the conversations were heated, filled with both defense and condemnation. Some of the higher-ups argued that the arrest had been a necessary action, a response to what they viewed as a growing threat to the stability of the school system. Others, especially the younger officers, the ones who had been in the room when Julia was dragged away, questioned the necessity of the response. The whispers of doubt were beginning to surface, and it was clear that cracks were forming in the foundation of the law enforcement community's stance. One officer, Detective Harris, a young man who had been with the department for only a few years, was among those who had begun to ask questions. His training had taught him that authority must be respected, but the images of Julia, her face contorted with both defiance and fear, her voice shaking but unwavering, kept replaying in his mind. He wasn't sure if what had happened was right, and the more he thought about it, the more the incident gnawed at him. During a meeting with his superiors, Harris finally voiced his concerns. What we did, taking her away like that, before even hearing her out, was it really necessary? There are parents, teachers, and even fellow officers starting to ask questions. If we don't start looking at this differently, if we don't admit that we overstepped, it's going to get worse. His superior, Lieutenant Mitchell, scoffed. Don't be naive. It was a controlled situation. There's no reason to question it. She was a disruptor, plain and simple. But Harris couldn't shake the thought. What if the real disruptors are the ones who are trying to keep everything the way it is? What if the system itself is broken, and the only way to fix it is to start holding people accountable for the way they treat those who challenge it? For the first time in a long time, Harris wasn't sure where his duty lay. He had always believed in the importance of maintaining order, of following protocol, but now the boundaries seemed more blurred than ever. He couldn't help but wonder if the truth was being buried under layers of power and privilege, if the very people who were supposed to enforce justice were, in fact, complicit in denying it. As the weeks went by, these private reflections began to form a broader discussion among law enforcement. There was no denying the tension that had risen between the public and the police, between those who saw Julia as a whistleblower and those who saw her as a threat to the status quo. For some officers, Julia had become a symbol of the growing discontent within society, a challenge to everything they thought they understood about justice. For others, she had exposed the cracks in their own hearts, made them question what they stood for. With Julia leading the charge from the outside and Harris and a few like-minded officers quietly questioning the actions of their colleagues, the first cracks in the system began to form. What started as a few whispers turned into a louder conversation about accountability, about the need to confront the deeper issues within both the school and the police system. The walls that had once seemed unbreakable were beginning to show signs of fracture. Julia wasn't done yet. She had started this fight with a pair of shoes, but now she was determined to see it through to the end. Not just for Andrew, but for every child who had ever been let down by the system. Her heart, bruised and battered, was more determined than ever. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, rallies, and press conferences, but through it all, Julia felt the growing strength of the movement she had ignited. The momentum wasn't just in the headlines. It was in the people who stood by her, who recognized that her fight wasn't just her own. It was a collective struggle against the forces that had long kept so many oppressed, their voices silenced by power, privilege, and fear. Julia's resolve had crystallized in the face of the backlash, and though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: she would not back down. She stood before a crowd at one of the rallies, her voice steady despite the weight of the fight that lay ahead. Behind her were families, teachers, activists, people who had come to believe in the possibility of change. And in the front row, Andrew, the student whose life had sparked it all, stood with his mother, a proud smile on his face. He had been suspended for his act of defiance, but the truth had risen above the lies, and he was no longer just a student in a broken system. He was a symbol, and in that moment, Julia realized that he wasn't the only one. There were so many like him, so many whose stories had gone untold, whose pain had been ignored, whose struggles had been dismissed. This fight, Julia began, her voice ringing out across the crowd, isn't just about one school, one teacher, or one student. It's about a system that has failed too many for too long. It's about the truth that has been buried under the weight of lies. We've all been complicit in accepting things as they are, but no more. We cannot sit by and allow injustice to continue in our communities, in our schools, in our workplaces. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. We must keep pushing. We must keep fighting for those whose voices have been drowned out. We have to demand change, not just in the laws, but in the hearts of the people who uphold them. This is bigger than any one of us. This is about creating a world where the truth can be heard, where no one is silenced, where no one is forgotten. The crowd erupted in applause, but Julia's heart was already focused on what came next. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over until the system that had oppressed so many was dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. But in that moment, surrounded by the faces of those who had joined her cause, she understood that real change was possible. It wouldn't come easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it would come. It had to. As the rally ended and the crowd slowly dispersed, Julia found herself standing alone for a moment, reflecting on everything she had been through. The pain, the doubt, the fear. It had all led her here. But now she could feel the first stirrings of something new, something greater than the sum of its parts. It was the power of people coming together, demanding justice, and refusing to let it go. Julia knew that this was just the beginning. The fight against systemic racism and injustice would be long and difficult. But as long as there were people like her, people who refused to stand down, who saw injustice and said, "No more," there was hope. The road ahead would be hard, but it was a road she was ready to walk. The spark that had been ignited in her was now a fire that could not be extinguished. And though she didn't know exactly what the future would bring, she knew one thing: she would not stop until the world had changed. The fight was far from over, but with each step, she would get closer to the justice she had always believed in.